Today we're very excited to have with us Dr. Vidoll Regisford. He is a psychotherapist and counselor who specializes in anti-racism, anti-Black racism, equity, and how it affects the Black community, but all communities. He works also with individuals and corporations so that we can see the effects of anti-racism and trauma on the community. So thank you very much for joining us. This group came about after George Floyd's death, when we wanted to see change and we worried about our Black sons and didn't want what happened to him to happen to any other Black boy. And so for that, we want to know, how do we help our Black sons so that they can make sense of what's happening in the news, in the media, because it's a lot and it's negative and it's scary.
Yeah, let's go back to the George Floyd event that signaled a worldwide dialogue, discourse on race, and specifically anti-Black racism. I think, governments, corporations, and the like struggled for the first time. And we struggled because of two things. One, the pandemic forced us inside. So it wasn't easy for us to dismiss this as a 30-second clip on the news. We had the time to sit and watch this. And the second thing is, we saw that this man was lynched through 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And I'm deliberate and intentional about my language. It was a lynching. Yes, it's a murder, but it was a lynching. It was a modern day form of lynching. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, all of us watched that man beg for his life. Secondly, or thirdly, no one to rescue him because of the police and their power. So I want to situate the conversation in George Floyd, but not leave it there because this has been happening for years. I think it happens to be the zeitgeist that has caused us to sit back and think about, when will this end? When you think about Black boys and Black men, you think about them and their identity that isn't necessarily hidden or concealed. It's not that an identity can be negotiated. It's visible. And so by virtue of that visibility, they're exposed, whether it be they're walking the streets in Toronto and they're being carded for no reasons, or whether it be like me, they're driving a nice car in a nice residential neighborhood, and they're stopped and asked for ID. And then followed with the question, what do you do for a living? That has nothing to do with the rolling stop that I allegedly made, but that's the reality of walking in this Black body. So when you think about the impact of that repeated trauma on one's consciousness, on one's life, as a form of violation over a period of time, exponentially, it does raise serious mental health issues. And so when we think about Black boys and alleged anger that they express in school, on the street, we have to reimagine what their lives have been through right up until that point. What have they experienced? The traumatic events have also signaled a connection amongst Black men. I see more and more Black men being more conscious and aware of themselves as individuals, but also their brothers. And I don't want to leave this in simply a conversation about Blackness, but there have been allies who've come along. White people, brown people, indigenous folks who've come along and who've said, we too see this, and we are joining forces with you. We are locking arms with you against this form of racism, anti-Black racism, and we're going to call it, we're going to name it. So those are the opening remarks that I want to make. As parents, it's indeed challenging. You're having conversations that your white counterparts don't have to have around safety, around their own security, around how they conduct themselves, which in fact is a limitation of their freedoms to be themselves.
So Dr. Regisford, I don't mean to interrupt you, but you've said a lot there, and I can imagine both for us as parents and for our audience, people are processing so many of those nuggets that you gave us. I know one of the things that I struggle with personally, and I'm sure my peers as well, often those comments, and I have a very strong, tall, what I would describe as manly Black husband, and intentionally or otherwise often uses the words with my son, man up, right? So there's this whole, we want our children to be in touch with their feelings, especially given the repeated trauma that they experience, yet they're also hearing, men don't cry or boys don't cry and boys show strength. So how do we navigate that very delicate and sometimes confusing messaging?
Well, I would distinguish this. The notion of the alpha male, the notion of manning up, it really is a message or a comment about maturity. I know in the common vernacular it can be used in a way that might seem degrading or really challenging or off-putting. But I think the more subtle message there is about maturity. And your companion, perhaps out of his own anxiety, is trying to instruct him to be prepared. Be prepared for when I am not there. Be prepared for when mom is not there. Are you capable? Are you competent enough to handle those situations in a mature manner that doesn't get you in trouble? But yes, indeed. Can we use different language? Absolutely. But if we use a common vernacular amongst males, it is perhaps from that school of alpha male dialogue that says, come on, step up. Show me your game. I want you to be strong. I want you to be independent and responsible and aware so that when I'm not there, you can manage yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
It makes me think about, Heather, how you were saying that it's sometimes hard for us to talk to our Black boys about their feelings, and but also I think that even in our community, mental health concerns are kind of looked on with a stigma. I don't know, I was wondering, Dr. Regisford, if that's been your experience. And, I know that me being a Black woman didn't keep me from suffering from postpartum depression, and that I know other Black women, Black men who also face mental health concerns, but sometimes it's kind of just pushed aside or said that, oh, well, just, pray about it, or just man up, feel better, even to women, right? But would you say that that is true in the Black community, and how do we kind of start changing the conversation around that?
I would say it's changing. It's changing. Awareness of mental health as a reality within families, all families, including Black families, has caused individuals to recognize the need for them to adopt their thinking in this new culture, in this society that says, look, we can no longer hide this, because the complexities of the behaviors and the responses affect families, whether it be having to take days off work or interfacing with the police or going to school. Families are now realizing that they cannot do it on their own, and so hiding it and concealing it no longer works. They're also recognizing that there are supports available. You have community centers right here in Scarborough, like Taboo, a Black-focused Afro-Canadian community health center. You've got mental health services that are ethno-racially specific, in that they only serve ethno-racial communities. So you can go to those services and be assured of some level of compatibility with the therapists, the clinicians who you're working with. You have social workers who are coming out of school. We haven't gone that far with teachers as yet, but we can pray and continue to hope. But social workers who are coming out and learning and understanding anti-oppression, understanding racism, anti-oppression training. That's helpful. And last but not least, recognizing that if you're employed and you have benefits, that you can access that through your employer, that you're already paying for the service. Not only does our generous healthcare system provide supports and resources, but you can also access private resources through your company benefits to seek clinical help for your family or for your children. So I think that's changing. It's slow, but it's changing. And the other addition to that is organizations like this are popping up all over the place, all over the GTA, all over Canada, where folks are recognizing the need for us to organize and in some instances resist the systemic oppression, the systemic racism, all of this is a good thing.
Yeah, thank you. I have one quick follow-up to that. I know when we read your bio, I'm not sure if, when we read it online, that it talks about your being culturally competent, and I wonder, do you suggest that if we are looking for a therapist for our sons or anybody in our family, that we look for a Black therapist? Is that important? Is there a different way of counseling that happens? You know, we're also talking about the ethno-cultural specific clinics and that. Is that important?
So being culturally competent does not necessitate being Black or white or any other color. It really is a competency, it really is a skill. It just so happens that we are at the cusp, or we turn the corner on really understanding how we integrate culture, race, gender in mental health, in education. And it so happens that, yes, those who are Black might be more able to respond to a youth or to a family member. So asking for that service is ideal for the individual, but it should not be. If we just reimagine the world being different, I mean, you teach children, you're a principal, we work with clients. Guess what? Our skills and our competence have to be applied to them, whether you're white or Black. Well, it should be the same thing. Teachers should be culturally competent enough that they can work with a Black student or an Indigenous student. Therapists, the same way. It's about the training, it's about the colleges they come from that needs to change and adapt. So let's take education. We don't like this, but let's take education.
Take it.
A system that is perhaps the most moribund system around. 70 years, 80 years, no change.
Right.
We still teach students to go out and work for someone else, even though we're in an electronic age. We still put teachers through teachers' college, and very few of them deal with anti-oppression. Yet still, they're the largest referrers to children's aid. Not the neighbor who sees something going on in their home, or perhaps the police officer or the storekeeper. No, teachers are by and large the #1 referral sources to children's aid. Why? There's a level of ignorance, and I would say that politely, a level of intellectual ignorance that has not been translated in their training to better assess whether that's someone who brings a roti to school, if that is really a child safety issue, vis-a-vis understanding that a child from a different ethnic group will have different ethnic food that they bring to school to eat. And perhaps I should learn about that before I call children's aid. So I know I've been long-winded, but cultural competency in an ideal world should be applied to everyone who's working in professional capacity. However, having said that, one does find that clinical alignment, that psychological, cultural alignment and attunement with someone who they can easily identify with. And I think it's perfectly acceptable to say, yeah, for attunement and for alignment, the values and an understanding of my culture and race, this would be my preference.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I've learned certainly a lot about cultural competency today. You know, for me, one of the things, and I work in a corporation where I think people are trying to make their best efforts in terms of moving the anti-Black discrimination or the anti-racism needle. I'm finding one of the struggles though is calling it what it is. So when we use terms like cultural competency, that could mean so many things. I want us to get to a place where we're using the words, we're using the terms, we're actually calling it out, because I don't know how much of it is cultural competency and how much of it is, we treat Black and Indigenous people in a particular way. We treat them in a way that we don't often treat people who don't look like that. So how do we move towards calling it what it is and really focusing on our Black children and the lack of competency as it relates to those Black children?
From my perspective, we've been too reliant on policy change, procedural change, and systemic change from the top. And although I think that is important, I think what's important for us as practitioners and for parents is for us to begin to name it. For us to say clearly, no, this is what it is. This is anti-Black racism. I probably this is probably back in 2005 4 or 5 made a deputation to the school board in Peel about anti-black racism, when that was not even being talked about. And here we are in 2020, and it's now part of our current dictionary. Well, it started with conversations around anti-black racism and really pushing the agenda. And so I agree with you, Heather. I think that where it's appropriate, I think it's up to us to change the narrative and talk about the anti-oppressive, to talk about anti-black racism, the anti-indigeneity, for example. I think is perfectly acceptable for us to begin to push back and say, no, this is what it is. Let us name it.
We've seen a similar thing in education with, there's this thing called culturally responsive pedagogy, right? And culturally responsive pedagogy came out of a need for anti-black racism, but now in so many boards, it's kind of got watered down, and it's like, it doesn't name it. And I think that's why we're seeing now a lot more, clearly naming it. We're talking about anti-black racism, we're talking about anti-racism. That is, we need anti-racist practices, not just culturally responsive or culturally competent, because those words, although they probably meant the same, intentionally, they've kind of been watered down and they don't have the same impact.
So these are all words that we as adults, we understand. But when we're talking about our Black sons who don't necessarily know the wording, but they know that at school, they're experiencing something different than their white counterpart, or on the news, something continues to happen to Black men. How do we help them to understand, and how do we support them as moms, as parents?
So I would say to parents, when you have teenagers, you're engaged less in parenting and more in influencing. And that's an uphill piece of work. And why? Because teenagers feel that they know everything and that the world is their footstool and they can do anything and they're always right.
Yeah.
So, for you teenagers. But I think part of this work is about having those conversations around the table that are really interrogatives. What are your experiences? Why do you think that's happening? What do you think you can do about it? What is the appropriate naming of that? I think it's important for us as parents to have those conversations with our students and let them know that it's okay to label an experience as being racist or being sexist or being biased or whatever the case may be, and not to be ashamed of it, but to have the language and the argument to support that. That's critical. And it's critical for them and their own intellectual development as well as their esteem and their self-worth. So having the conversations around the table, checking in, but also taking an approach that is more of an interrogative. You're asking questions to elicit a response that you can then challenge. You can then have them think a bit more about it rather than telling them. Because ultimately you want them to go out into the world where they see behaviors that they're doing their own analysis and their own unpacking and packaging it in a way that they can articulate it.
Wow. That was pretty powerful. I love the idea of being an influencer rather than a parent. I mean, geez, parenting is so much work. But fair enough. I think that's fabulous, and that's exactly it, right? So many of our children are starting to enter that age where we can no longer tell them, don't do this just because I said so. We want to equip them with those tools and those skills to be able to challenge both us and the slippery world that we live in. So I'm looking at the boss, and I think she's giving us the 5-minute warning. So I don't know, do any of us have another burning question for Dr. Regisford? Because I mean, it's been a great conversation so far. I'm hoping we can get one more question in. The Jeopardy music.
I wonder, Dr. Regisford, when you were speaking earlier with Joshua, and you talked about what happened to him being racial trauma. And we know that our kids are going into schools where they are facing racial trauma. They're facing systems that aren't built for them, curriculums that don't include them. And I was mentioning earlier about Bettina Love's book, We Just Want to Survive, and she talks about spirit murdering, like that schools are murdering the spirits of our kids. And how do we talk to our kids about that and that so that they learn to love their race. But I have really young kids, and when I talk to her about racism, my daughter sometimes feels like, oh, is it bad to be Black? You know, how do you deal with that with children, little children up to teenagers?
It's an ongoing conversation. It starts exactly when they're young. Don't start having this conversation when they get into high school. It might be too late because their peers and their friends will probably influence it. You as parents need to start a conversation at an early age. And it will be difficult, but again, it's using tools and resources and it's being consistent with that conversation and with the message so that it becomes inculcated in their identity and in their frame of thinking. What happens to us is that we're often not consistent. We stop, start. You know, think about some of our friends who have taken their kids to Saturday African History School. That's been a constant work. And so those kids, when they grow up to be teenagers, they are so conscious of themselves and their race, they can identify things immediately. That's what we need to do. And not be ashamed of it. Because as they grow, as they enter into their teens, certainly their adolescence, the whole world around them begins to make sense. In fact, they begin to manipulate the world around them because they figure, okay, now I see what mom and dad are saying. I now get it, I now understand it. My last part of comments is this. We've talked about a lot of things, and you guys are doing great work. You're all doing fabulous work. But I want to position this work with other work that's happening not only globally, nationally, and within the GTA. In my spirit as of late, I've been talking about this whole idea of a Black Renaissance. This emerging of a Black consciousness that says, in spite of our challenges, in spite of the George Floyds, and the disproportionate number of us who have been affected by the pandemic, and the recent event that Joshua had to experience, we still have hope. The commodity that we peddle, that is undeniable, is hope. This unbridled idea that there's a better day to come. The good thing is that we get to cast it, we get to craft it, not only for ourselves here, but also for our children and our grandchildren. And that's the amazing thing. So we get to roll up our sleeves, we get to get in the trenches, and we get to have a conversation, and we get to talk about, well, let's get mothers talking together in Durham. Let's get organized with students in Peel. Let's get organized around the problems and build networks and relationships, because we are in this space of a Black Renaissance, where we will have Black young men, Black young women who represent us well, who live by a credo of excellence and nothing short of that. That's where we're at. So I don't want to lose them, because there are Black university students, Black professionals who are young and vibrant, do dynamic things, changing the world, entering into spaces that we have never now had to be. And we can't forget that, because that is reflective of us. So I leave you with that.
Thank you very much. And that's a valuable point that we often don't hear about the people that are doing excellence. And as you know, this podcast, we couldn't do it without the people behind the scenes. We have Chris and we have Mika, and you've heard them in Liam. And today, we want to also make recognition of other people, Black boys that are doing excellence. And one of them is Mateo Rojo Bolton. He's an 11-year-old student in grade 6 who is an artist. He has many other skills, but his artwork and creativity is just incredible. So we'll be ending the show today with examples of his artwork. And if you have other pieces of work, or if you have a son who's talented or skilled in a particular area, please let us know. We'd like to highlight the excellence that's happening in our Black community. Thank you again to Dr. Vidoll Regisford for joining us. Thank you for joining us.